It's Monday evening, August 16th, 1976. A British Army surveillance has just been lifted on James Mitchell's farm, near the village of Glenan, in the Northern Irish county of Armagh. On the farm, a number of men are present, including Mitchell, who was an RUC reservist, and John Weir, who was an RUC officer. They were joined by members of the loyalist paramilitary group, the UVF. Their plot to bomb a pub in the Republic of Ireland had been thwarted after police were tipped off. But even though they knew that they had just recently been surveilled, the group gathered at the farm and chose a new target, the Step In pub, and continued to plan the evening's bombing, with no fear that they would be arrested by the army. The attack that night would go on to kill 2 people, but there would be many, many more people killed by this group, who in later years would be named the Glenan Gang. This was a group made up of loyalist paramilitaries, specifically members of the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF. But what made the Glenan Gang different is that they were also made up of members of the British Army's Ulster Defence Regiment and the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC. Some sources attribute around 120 killings to this group, or permutations of them, and in this episode we will learn about who the Glenan Gang were and what attacks were generally attributed to them. We will then hone in on 2 specific pub attacks, which illustrate the devastating effects collusion has when it comes to attacks on the Catholic population. This is a dense, complicated episode, but I will do my best to explain everything as clearly as possible. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. For much of the early 1970s, normal life in Northern Ireland was unravelling at the seams. The British Army had come in, Bloody Sunday had happened, direct rule from Westminster, internment and daily bombings and shootings. The death toll in 1972 was the worst of the entire Troubles, with 480 people losing their lives to violence. By this stage, the Provisional IRA were in quite a strong position. In Northern Ireland, they heavily ramped up their attacks on members of the security services, and then they also had extended their bombing campaign across to mainland Great Britain. Towards the end of 1973, the Provisional IRA were perceived to have the upper hand. Then on February 10th, 1975, the Provisional IRA and British government entered into truce negotiations. But these negotiations were not popular with the loyalist paramilitary groups, the UDA and the UVF. They wanted to continue their campaign against the Provisional IRA and Catholic civilians. And the British Army also felt like they were making significant progress combating the IRA, so were not happy to be told to cease operations. The truce officially lasted until February 1976, but there was a significant increase in sectarian killings during this time. Ulster loyalists believed that the British government was going to strike a deal with Republicans, totally ignoring them, so they wanted to derail this peace, and it was during this particularly chaotic period that a group of loyalists formed an alliance of sorts, which would in later years be known as the Glenan Gang. The campaign of violence waged by the gang caused a significant death toll, and the area they operated in was dubbed the ominous name the Murder Triangle due to the sheer amount of people who lost their life at their hands. But to really understand this gang, there are some key players and groups which need to be introduced. So we will start with the Ulster Defence Regiment. The Ulster Defence Regiment, or UDR, was an infantry regiment of the British Army. Unlike the British Army, which was mainly made up of English and Scottish individuals, the UDR was primarily composed of Northern Irish Protestants. The objective was to have both Catholic and Protestant membership, which represented the demographics in Northern Ireland at the time, of which around 36% of the population was Catholic. Catholics could join up, and from its inception in 1970, they encompassed around 18%, but after internment in 1972, this figure drops down to 3%. Many Catholics didn't trust the British Army after internment, Bloody Sunday and Operation Motorman. And the IRA also threatened to assassinate any Catholic who joined the UDR. As well as that, many Catholics who joined the UDR also felt like they were being intimidated by their Protestant peers. The UDR's role was to assist the police force, the RUC, carrying out checkpoints and patrols in the hope to hinder paramilitary activity while also reassuring the public. Members of the UDR didn't live in barracks and would often live at home with their families. This left them vulnerable to attacks from the Provisional IRA, and in total, 197 UDR officers were killed while active servicemen, with another 61 killed after they'd left the UDR. The UDR will get their own episode eventually, but how exactly do they tie into the Glenan Gang? Well, many loyalists managed to join the UDR, despite a vetting process that was meant to prevent this. In the words of UDR member Lieutenant Colonel Beard, quote, "I will not tolerate any active participation by members of this battalion in any organisation which encourages violence. You cannot play on both teams. Either you believe in law and order applied equally to all men, or you believe in violence as a means of achieving political ends. In this respect, the UDA is no better than IRA. Not only should you take no part in UDA activities, but you should discourage your fellow citizens from doing so." Paramilitary loyalists who eluded the vetting process and enlisted suddenly had access to a litany of intel, weapons and uniforms. If these passed into the wrong hands, they could be used to contribute to attacks carried out to the Catholic population, which could have devastating consequences. An example of this was highlighted in the excellent documentary Unquiet Graves, where one 9mm Sterling submachine gun was stolen from a UDR barracks which was directly linked to the killing of 11 Catholic civilians. Okay, let's move on to the paramilitary group, the UVF. In this episode, we are specifically talking about the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the group, the UVF, who were a branch based out of the towns of Lurgan and Portadown in Northern Ireland. The brigade was founded by Billy Hanna. Hanna served in the British Army and took part in the Korean War, earning a medal for his bravery. After he left the British Army, he then joined up with a number of groups, and then joined the Ulster Special Constabulary, otherwise known as the B Specials, which were a quasi-military reserve police force that had been around since 1920, but gained notoriety at the onset of the Troubles for being aligned with loyalist paramilitaries. They were disbanded in 1970 after being deemed unfit to handle the civil unrest in Northern Ireland. One of the reasons for disbandment occurred after they responded to rioting in 1969 by using deadly force, which was considered reckless and irresponsible. After they were disbanded, the Ulster Defence Regiment was set up, and many ex-B Specials signed up with the UDR. Billy Hanna was a weapons instructor for a while, then attained the rank of sergeant with the UDR, and was in that position until he was dismissed after 2 years, accused of taking part in UVF activity. He then set up the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF in his hometown of Lurgan. In October 1972, a large amount of weapons and ammunition was stolen from a UDR depot in Lurgan. Hanna went about recruiting loyalists from the Portadown and Lurgan areas, and recruited some notable individuals, including Robin the Jackal Jackson, Harris Boyle, Wesley Somerville, David Alexander Mulholland, and William Fulton. Boyle and Somerville would go on to lose their lives in 1975 in the Miami Showband killings, after the bomb they were planting under the driver's seat of the band's van prematurely detonated. William Fulton was a prominent loyalist who was close to Billy Wright and the Loyalist Volunteer Force, aka LVF. The investigation which led to his arrest in 2002 is an absolutely fascinating one, and I may have to tell the story sometime. That brings us to Robin Jackson. Robin the Jackal Jackson was one of the most significant loyalist figures who operated throughout the Troubles. He has been tied to at least 50 killings in Northern Ireland. That being said, though he was arrested on occasion, he was never convicted in connection with any of the killings, and to this day, very little is known of his involvement. But from my research, his name comes up time and time again. It's believed that Jackson and Hanna were amongst those who organised the Dublin Monaghan bombings, but it was these bombings which would lead to a falling out between the men. On July 27, 1975, it was in the early hours of the morning when Hanna arrived home from a function with his wife. The following account comes from Martin Dillon and Irish writer and journalist Hugh Jordan. 2 men approached Hannah, one of which was Robin Jackson. Hannah asked them, "What are you playing at?" And then Jackson produced a gun, placed it at his temple and shot him. A second shot was then fired into Hannah's head while he lay on the ground. Another individual in a car nearby was shot in the head but survived. So why was Hannah killed? Well, it is believed that Hannah was killed so that Robin Jackson could assume command of the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF. Apparently Hannah had remorse in the wake of the Dublin Monaghan bombings and the role he played in killing, quote, all those children in Dublin. He had decided on the location of the bomb car in Parnell Street in Dublin, which went on to kill 2 infant girls and 8 other individuals when it detonated. So when Jackson and others were planning the Miami Showband killings, Hannah didn't want any part in it. So it is believed that he was killed and Robin Jackson took over the Mid-Ulster Brigade. Another take is that Hannah was shot after Jackson learned that he had passed information along to the security services regarding the Dublin Monaghan bombings. And as he was aware of the upcoming Miami Showband ambush, he was a security risk and needed to be eliminated. In the paramilitary world, once you were labelled an informer or tout, you had to be taken out. The final allegation I came across regarding Hannah's death is that he was killed so that Jackson could gain access to a cache of weapons he possessed. This topic is incredibly murky, and there's always alternate takes on killings such as these, and there's probably an element of truth in every take. So with Robin Jackson at the reins of the Mid-Ulster Brigade, what happened next? On the 31st of July 1975, popular show band The Miami had just finished a show in Banbridge in Northern Ireland, and were on their way home to Dublin when they were stopped at what appeared to be a British Army checkpoint. The 5 men were ordered out of their minibus and then lined up facing the ditch at the rear of the vehicle. As their names were checked, 2 men were secretly placing a bomb under the driver's seat of the minibus. It is believed that the intention was for the bomb to be placed and the men returned back to their vehicle. They would then cross over into the Republic of Ireland, where the bomb would then detonate. But this isn't what transpired. As the bomb was placed inside the minibus, it tilted on its side, causing it to detonate prematurely, blowing the 2 men, Wesley Somerville and Harris Boyle, to pieces instantly. The bomb killed the men and destroyed the minibus, and at that moment the remaining loyalists opened fire on the 5 men standing outside of the van. 3 musicians were killed: lead singer Fran O'Toole, trumpeter Brian McCoy, and guitarist Tony Geraghty. This is but one of the attacks which was purported to have been carried out by the Glenan Gang. But soon after the attack, the question was asked, were the British security services involved too? As there have been many accounts of a man dressed in a soldier's uniform with a British accent at the scene shortly before the shooting. John Weir plays a central role in the telling of the story of the Glenan Gang. He was an Ulster loyalist born in the Republic of Ireland in 1950. He was an officer in the RUC's Special Patrol Group. These were essentially the RUC's anti-terror unit. They were a tactical reserve of 310 officers whose role was to, quote, provide support to divisional policing, both uniform and CID, which is the Criminal Investigations Department, to police interface areas at times of civil unrest, and to do so in a disciplined way. The Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC, was overwhelmingly Protestant, and the Special Patrol Group, or SPG unit, was 100% Protestant, and Weir claimed that they were very anti-Republican and rife with sectarian attitudes. Weir claimed that he and his colleagues regularly bet up Catholic civilians with Republican sympathies. By the end of 1973, the SPG was unhappy with the political stance in Westminster regarding Northern Ireland. The British government had adopted a softly approach, which meant that they were acting cautiously and patiently, avoiding direct action or force. Some members of the SPG felt that they would have to, quote, break the rules to curb the terrorists. John Francis Green was a member of the Provisional IRA who was interned in Long Kesh. In 1973, he managed to escape from prison disguised as a priest. He fled across the border into the Republic of Ireland, staying in the Monaghan and Castleblaney areas. On the evening of January 10th, 1975, UVF gunmen burst into the safe house where Green had been staying and executed him, shooting him 6 times in the head. John Weir was suspected to have had some involvement in this killing. It's believed that he tipped off members of the RUC Special Branch regarding where Green had been staying, and subsequently Green was killed by the UVF. So how did Green's location get into the hands of the UVF, and was it through the RUC? In the 70s, Weir seemed to have a double life. On one hand, his career in the RUC was continuing, which would eventually see him promoted to the rank of sergeant. But Weir had a secret. He had joined the paramilitary group the UVF, and had become a rising star in the group. First meeting with Robin Jackson in 1974. As a member of the UVF, Weir was loosely linked to a number of attacks, but it wasn't until 1976 when it was believed that he joined the Glenan Gang. He did this in part because that same year the Kingsmill massacre had occurred, which saw 10 Protestant workmen executed by Republican gunmen as they were on their way home from work. Weir believed the culprits to be the Provisional IRA and thought that they would continue to target Protestant civilians. So he believed that he would be useful to the UVF since he was still an active member of the police force, the RUC. His first active role within the UVF happened in the Irish county of Monaghan on August 15, 1976. The UVF had planned to bomb a bar later that evening, and Weir drove there in the morning to make sure that the roads were clear, doing what was considered a dry run before the bombing. He was stopped by the Irish Gardaí, to which he showed them his RUC identification. They said that they were stopping cars as they believed that a bombing was due to take place that day. They had no idea that they were talking to the RUC officer who was actually involved in the bomb plot itself. The bombing ended up happening elsewhere the following night in the Northern Irish town of Keady, killing 2 people. We'll come back to this later on. In 1977, Catholic man William Strathern was killed in his home. It was 2 a.m. at night when 2 men knocked on his door, which was also the village's main shop and chemist, saying that they needed to get medication for a sick child. When Strathern opened the door, he was shot dead by 2 gunmen. Strathern was targeted because the men incorrectly believed that he was a member of the Provisional IRA. In total, 4 people were believed to have taken part in this killing. Weir and fellow SPG RUC member William McCaughey were at the scene but claimed that they remained in the getaway car. Weir named the gunmen as Robin Jackson and Robert John Kerr. Weir's role was to procure the weapon, and he acquired a clean Colt .45. He claimed that he and McCaughey stayed in the getaway car while the 2 other men carried out the killing. He was eventually arrested for this killing in 1979 and soon confessed to taking part. But it was what he said during his interrogation that has been some of his most controversial statements made to date. Weir said that he arranged the killing of Strathern because he had been ordered to by members of RUC Special Branch. He then went on to name Jackson and Kerr as the men who carried out the shooting. Despite Weir naming the 2 men as the gunmen, they were never arrested, nor were they ever interviewed by the RUC. An RUC officer claimed that the men were never questioned, quote, for reasons of operational strategy. Weir had offered to testify against Kerr and Jackson on the proviso that the charges against him were dropped, so that should be taken into account. The prosecution declined this offer. The Assistant Director of the Public Prosecutions believed that interviewing them would be a waste of time. Quote, Kerr and Jackson have not been interviewed by the police because the police state they are virtually immune to the interrogation, and the common police consensus to arrest and interview either man is a waste of time. Both men are known to police to be very active and notorious UVF murderers. Nevertheless, the police do not recommend consideration of withdrawal of charges against Weir. I agree with this view. Weir and McCaughey must be proceeded against. When proceedings against them are terminated, the position may be reviewed in respect of Jackson and Kerr. Weir went on to say, I think it is important to make it clear that this collusion between loyalist paramilitaries, such as Robin Jackson and my RUC colleagues and me, was taking place with the full knowledge of my superiors. He then claimed that Jackson and Kerr were, quote, untouchable, as they were secretly British agents. Weir was convicted in 1980 and spent 13 years in prison before being released in 1993. There's a fair bit of time skipping happening in this episode, but bear with me and hopefully by the end it makes a little bit of sense, because now we're jumping forward to 1999. In 1999, a journalist was being sued for £100 million in a libel case after he accused two men of being members of a secret group, which was most likely the Glenan Gang. To bolster his defence, John Weir signed an affidavit, which is a sworn, written statement, and this affidavit is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle when it comes to understanding Collusion and the Glenan Gang. In the affidavit, Weir outlined instances of collusion between the RUC, SPG, UDR, and loyalist paramilitaries such as Robin Jackson. Weir then named Robin Jackson and Billy Hanna as leaders of the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF. He also named Jackson as the gunman in many killings. Jackson died of lung cancer in 1998, so these statements were coming 1 year after he died. Weir also mentioned a name that will have a lot more prominence in the rest of this story, James Mitchell. He then linked the Dublin Monaghan bombings to attacks in Northern Ireland and to the Miami Showband attacks and many other bombings. He stated that the bombs used in the Dublin Monaghan bombings were supplied by a UDR officer and then stored and assembled on the farm of James Mitchell. I'll come back to James Mitchell quite soon, as his role in the Glenan Gang is significant. In the affidavit, Weir mentioned that 6 months after the killing of William Strathern, senior RUC officers were made aware of Weir's connection to loyalist paramilitaries. He was summoned to a meeting with Chief Inspector Brian Fitzsimmons, head of the RUC Special Branch in Newry. Fitzsimmons told Weir that he was aware of his UVF activities. In Weir's own words, quote, "He told me he knew I had connections out there. That's why he wanted me to go out, make more connections, find out what was going on. He made it quite clear that the Special Branch was keeping an eye on me." Weir believes that this was an endorsement of his activities as an RUC officer and UVF paramilitary, but others claim that this was a warning to Weir. One journalist described it as, quote, "partly a warning and partly a bid for control of his informant." Weir went on to explain that he felt stuck in between two groups, the RUC Special Branch and the intelligence gathering section of the British Army, called Intelligence Corps. He claims that British Army Major Robertson encouraged him to carry out an assassination attempt on Provisional IRA member Thomas Slab Murphy. Weir then informed two Special Branch members of the idea and he was discouraged. There was also another instance where Weir told his Special Branch handlers of a plot to kill IRA man Desi O'Hare, and he was initially encouraged to do it. Then when he showed up at the pub to carry out the kidnapping, which would lead to the killing, the publican had been informed. So how do we know that Weir's claims are accurate and trustworthy? Well, we don't. We do know that Paul O'Connell of the Pat Finucane Centre spent days with Weir, asking him questions about his affidavit and putting the pieces together. He came to the conclusion that Weir's evidence was credible and that his allegations must be regarded with the utmost seriousness. The Barron Report, which was released in 2003, which examined the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, came to the conclusion that British military personnel likely helped the UVF carry out the bombing. Weir was interviewed for this report, which concluded that Weir's evidence overall is credible. The RUC had their own report into Weir's allegations, which concluded that, quote, "As Weir is a convicted murderer, his credibility must be in doubt." James Mitchell has staunchly denied Weir's claims and referred to him as a damned liar and convicted murderer. Here's a quote from Weir from 2006. "I'm lucky to be above the ground. My family has suffered. There is no sense in my saying that I feel sorry for what I have done, but I do believe that it is important that each side looks at the other's point of view. A long-lasting peace will depend on one side showing they know the other side has also been wronged." Weir's statements are one of the only surviving accounts of the goings-on within the Glenan Gang in existence today, and that is why they are so crucial and so controversial at the same time. In the affidavit, Weir states that the base of operations for UVF attacks was a farm in the area of Glenanne, owned by James Mitchell. It's really hard to put into words how significant James Mitchell's contribution was to violent loyalism. And in the next episode, we will learn about James Mitchell's farm at Glenanne. We will then learn about the 2 bar attacks which cast an undeniable beam of collusion down across the landscape. That's it for this week. Thanks, and see you next time. I'm delighted to announce that the Troubles podcast is returning to the United Kingdom's favourite true crime podcast convention, CrimeCon 2024. Taking place in London on the 21st and 22nd of September, this is a 2-day event dedicated to all things true crime. I attended a couple of years ago and met my first fan in real life. He was a man by the name of Wilfred, so it's a pleasure to be returning again. So please do come along, it would be great to meet more fans. You can get tickets at crimecon.co.uk and quote Troubles to get a 10% discount. I'll see you there.